The ships without a banner, the void was never silent. It hummed, not in sound but in presence, like a vast cathedral filled with unseen voices. For millennia, civilizations had risen into this cathedral, each one bearing its banners high. The Verath came first, their armadas cloaked in silver fire, their crowns passed from monarch to monarch. Each star conquered a jewel in a lineage of emperors. Then came the Elari, who painted their sails with the blood-red insignia of dynasties older than most galaxies. Even the reptilian Threx bound their war hosts beneath the glyphs of their warrior kings, carved into scales of iron. The galaxy was a pageant of crowns. Nobility ruled the stars, and the fleets they commanded sailed as floating palaces, monuments to dynasties that believed themselves eternal. And then came humanity, no banners, no crowns, no dynasties. When the first Terran ships appeared on the star lanes, their hulls bore no shimmering crests, no gilded emblems. Their captains carried no bloodline titles, only names carved from sweat and history. Where other armadas blazed with ceremonial sigils, the Terran vessels emerged as steel shadows, carrying only their registry numbers and the silent resolve of crews, bound by something stranger than duty. The crowned races laughed. They are crownless, mocked the Verath lords. They are vagabonds of the void, beggars with engines strapped to rust. The Elari nobles scoffed as well, sipping their crystalline wines. How fragile a people, with no lineage to anchor them. Without banner or blood, they will scatter like dust before the first storm. And the Threx war chieftains sharpened their claws on the edges of their thrones, grinning with serrated teeth. Crownless meat is sweetest. Let us feast upon them first. But laughter is a fragile thing in war. The first clash came at the edge of the Orion Spur, when a Verath patrol fleet cornered 3 Terran destroyers in the dark. By all measures, the battle should have been brief. The Verath outgunned, outnumbered, outshone their foes. Yet when the smoke cleared, the stars bore witness to an impossible sight. The Verath fleet burning, their banners torn and drifting among the wreckage, while the 3 battered Terran ships limped away, not victorious, but unbroken. No noble crest had driven them. No ancient oath had guided their hand. They had fought not for crown or coin, but for each other, and that made them dangerous. It was in those days that Admiral Kaelen arose, a name whispered, then shouted, then carved into the marrow of history. He had no crown, no royal seal. His bloodline was not recorded in annals of dynasties, but in the mines of Europa, where his father had drowned in methane floods, and his mother had carved a life teaching children by candlelight. He wore no coronet, only the burn scars across his hands from a plasma breach during his youth as an engineer. And yet, when Kaelen stood before the fledgling Terran fleets, his voice carried something no noble banner could muster. The raw conviction of a man who believed that survival itself could become a crown. Remember this, he told his captains as they prepared for war. The crowned fight for symbols. We fight for each other, and that, my brothers and sisters, is a banner the galaxy will learn to fear. And so the Crownless Armada was born. It was not a single fleet at first, but a scattered constellation of ships, old freighters refitted with cannons, mining barges turned into carriers, warships salvaged from the bones of forgotten battles. They sailed under no unified crest, but wherever they went, the name Terran whispered like a spark across the void. Their enemies underestimated them at every turn. When the Elari nobles gathered their sapphire fleets to crush humanity at Vega, they expected a swift extermination. Yet they found themselves fighting men and women who did not retreat when their flagships fell, who pressed forward with eyes burning. Not because they had orders, but because to leave a comrade behind was unthinkable. When the Threx unleashed their war claws in the asteroid belts of Hadeon, they expected screams and flight. Instead, they found miners wielding plasma drills turned into weapons, fighters diving headlong into impossible odds, their last breath spent buying their brothers and sisters another heartbeat of survival. The Crownless Armada did not measure its worth in banners or noble decrees, but in bonds forged in fire, and the galaxy began to tremble. Yet for all their ferocity, the Crownless were not unscarred. Humanity bled, planets burned, ships cracked open into drifting coffins. The laughter of their enemies turned to snarls and then to strategies born not of contempt but of fear. The crowned races realized too late that what they faced was not an army but a tide with no throne to topple, no royal heart to pierce. You could not kill what had no crown, but every tide meets resistance. As the war spread across spiral arms, whispers reached Kaelen's fleet of a new enemy rising, an alliance of crowned houses, united for the first time in 1,000 years. Old rivalries dissolved in fear of the crownless. Dynasties that had once waged war for pride now stood shoulder to shoulder, pooling fleets into a coalition so vast that even the stars seemed to bend before their passage. The crowned would crush the crownless in one decisive blow. That was their plan. And Kaelen, standing upon the deck of his flagship Eidolon, staring into the abyss where this coalition gathered, knew the hour of judgment had come. Yet he felt no fear, for he knew something they did not. Crowns rust, banners burn, thrones topple. But love for a brother, for a sister, for a child waiting on a distant world, love was eternal. And love made soldiers out of miners, martyrs out of engineers, legends out of the forgotten. The galaxy was about to learn that the Crownless Armada did not sail for conquest, but for each other, and that, Kaelen thought, was a fire no dynasty could extinguish. The Ashes of Orion, the Orion Spur, was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard long before the first shot was fired. Gas clouds drifted like wounded titans, veiling shattered moons and ancient wrecks of empires that had risen and fallen before humanity had even learned fire. The place stank of history, of broken promises and rusting crowns, though in the vacuum of space no air carried such a scent. Yet every crewman felt it, an unspoken dread that this sector was cursed, that to fight here was to gamble with fate itself. It was here the Crowned Alliance chose to make their stand. They called it the Convergence of Thrones. Verath lords in silver phalanxes, Elari nobles with their sapphire sails unfurled like wings of dying angels, and Threx war clans bristling with barbed hulls. Never before had these dynasties united. Rivalries older than continents had been cast aside, their banners now stitched together into one tapestry of arrogance and fear. At its heart, a single vow echoed among them. The crownless must burn. Admiral Kaelen knew the trap before he saw it. His scouts whispered of it in hushed transmissions, fragments of sensor ghosts pointing to a massing so vast it drowned the stars themselves. Yet retreat was not an option. The Orion Spur was not only a passageway to the inner colonies, it was also home. Within the mists lay scattered settlements of Terran miners, farmers, and children, souls who could not simply vanish into hyperspace. To abandon Orion was to abandon them. And the Crownless Armada did not abandon their own. The Eidolon cut through the mists like a phantom. Its hull bore the scars of a dozen battles, gashes sealed with patchwork plating, scorch marks that no engineer bothered to polish away. Each wound told a story, and together they were a hymn sung in steel. Kaelen stood on its bridge, eyes fixed on the sensor readouts, listening not to the chatter of officers but to the silence between words. That silence told him everything. Fear, yes, but braided with a determination so fierce it hummed in the bones. "All ships reporting in," came the voice of Commander Saren, his second in command. Her voice was low, steady, but her hands gripped the railing too tightly. 34 vessels ready for engagement, mostly destroyers and frigates. The Peregrine reports engine strain but is holding formation. Civilian convoys have begun evacuation toward the Perseus route. Kaelen nodded. 34 against hundreds, against dynasties, against history itself, but numbers had never been the crownless measure of strength. "Signal the fleet," Kaelen said. "Today we do not fight for thrones. We fight for Orion. We fight for the children who dream beneath these stars. We fight because to leave one another behind is a language humanity has never learned." His words were carried across the commnet, reaching crews huddled in steel coffins of ships, reaching miners who had never held rifles until war demanded they do so, reaching mechanics who knew the hum of an engine better than the rhythm of their own hearts. Each heard and each found the silence within themselves broken, replaced by a steady drumbeat. The battle did not begin with trumpets. It began with fire. The crowned fleets emerged from the mists like gods descending. Their banners shimmered, great holographic veils projected across the void. The Verath silver phalanxes locked into diamond formations, their lances of plasma ready to carve holes into planets. The Elari sails caught starlight and bent it into radiant spears. The Threx hulls bristled with claws that dripped molten fury, eager to rend metal and bone alike. Against them, the Crownless Armada looked like scavengers. Ships patched together from wreckage, engines that coughed and sputtered, weapons stolen and welded. No banners, no crowns, no glory, only fire in their hearts. When the first salvo roared across the void, the galaxy held its breath. Orion ignited. Kaelen's fleet fought like wolves. The Eidolon led the charge, diving straight into the teeth of the Verath phalanx. Plasma fire scorched across its shields, tearing chunks of armor into glittering fragments. But where a noble fleet would have wheeled in elegant maneuvers, Kaelen's captains struck like miners with pickaxes, direct, brutal, unrelenting. They rammed, they clawed, they turned their own hulls into weapons. The Halcyon, a freighter once meant to haul ore, crashed into a Verath destroyer, tearing both ships apart in a sunburst of light. Yet even as its crew burned, their last transmissions carried laughter, not despair. The Elari nobles, aghast at such barbarity, pressed their advantage. Their sapphire sails unfurled into solar whips, slicing crownless frigates into shards. But the humans countered with improvisation born of desperation. Engineers vented cargo bays into the void, releasing storms of jagged debris that tore through Elari sails like knives through silk. For every ship lost, another rose to fight harder, as though grief itself was fuel. The Threx war clans surged next, descending like predators drunk on blood. Their hulls latched onto Terran ships, ripping at them with claws. Boarding skirmishes turned into brutal melees in corridors lit by fire and emergency strobes. Miners wielded drills against alien blades. Mothers who had once sewn clothes for their children drove pipes through armored beasts. Death came, but never quietly. And in every scream, in every strike, one truth echoed louder than any banner. They fought for each other. Hours passed like centuries. The Orion mists became firestorms, a galaxy within a galaxy of wreckage and ruin. Stars themselves seemed to dim beneath the fury. By the time Kaelen's ship reached the heart of the Coalition fleet, the Crownless Armada was shattered. Of 34 ships, fewer than 10 remained. Hulls split, decks flooded with fire, and still they pressed forward. Kaelen stood at the heart of it, calm as a man staring into his own grave. The Eidolon bled from a dozen wounds, its reactor howling like a wounded beast. Around him his crew worked not for orders but for each other, passing tools with bloodied hands, covering stations when comrades fell, refusing to leave their posts even as death crawled closer. In that crucible, Kaelen understood what the crowned could never, that nobility was not written in bloodlines or banners, but in the simple act of standing together when standing was impossible. And so, with what remained, he struck. The Eidolon plunged into the Coalition's command vessel, a cathedral of silver and sapphire where the Lords of Crowns had gathered to watch victory unfold. Shields cracked. Armor split. Kaelen ordered the reactor unshackled, its fury unleashed in a blinding scream. The explosion tore Orion apart. When the light faded, silence fell. The crowned fleets lay scattered, their banners shredded among the drifting debris. The Coalition had not been destroyed, but it had been humbled. Their thrones trembled, for in the Ashes of Orion, they had faced something they could not comprehend, an enemy without crown, yet stronger than any dynasty. Of the Crownless Armada, only fragments remained. A handful of ships limped into the shadows, carrying survivors who wept not for themselves but for the brothers and sisters who would never see home again. The galaxy declared Orion a draw. But among the survivors, a different truth was spoken in hushed voices. This was a victory, not of conquest but of spirit. The crownless could bleed, could break, but they could not be conquered. And though Admiral Kaelen was believed lost in the fire of the Eidolon, his name did not fade. It became a whisper that spread through colonies and outposts, through mines and farms and ships, a whisper that said, the crownless fight harder, a whisper that said, we are not done. The ghost of the Eidolon, the Orion spur, smoldered for months, not in fire, vacuum does not permit flame, but in wreckage, in drifting steel and fractured crowns, in the silence of 10,000 souls who would never return home. The battle was over, yet its echoes haunted every star it touched. Travelers whispered of phantom lights weaving through the nebulae, of voices carried on static that called out the names of the dead. But one whisper rose louder than all. Admiral Kaelen still lives. The galaxy had watched the Eidolon die. Every crown-bearing censor confirmed it. Every noble lord declared it fact. The flagship of the Crownless Armada had driven itself into the heart of the Coalition command vessel and lit the void in a white fury. To believe otherwise was madness, and yet, madness is often where legends are born. The survivors of Orion were few, scattered across the spiral arms like embers of a dying fire. The Halcyon's last transmission was laughter through flames. The Peregrine limped into Perseus space with half her crew dead, her captain refusing morphine so the wounded could have more. The freighter Nomad's Grace, hull split down the middle, crawled through the dark under makeshift sails of scavenged plating. They were not an armada anymore. They were fragments, broken, crownless in the truest sense. But in the void left by Kaelen's sacrifice, something strange began to grow. Across mining colonies and dust-worn settlements, the story spread. Kaelen had not died. Some said he had been taken by the void itself, reborn as a wraith to guide the crownless in their darkest hours. Others swore his escape pods had been sighted, vanishing into the mist before the final detonation. A few whispered he had walked from the wreckage of the Eidolon, body broken, spirit ablaze, carried away by the hands of survivors who owed him everything. The Crowned mocked these stories at first. They cling to ghosts, sneered the Verath lords, let them worship ashes. But mockery could not smother belief, and belief, in the hands of the desperate, becomes a weapon sharper than steel. Commander Saren had survived Orion. Once Kaelen's second in command, she now drifted in the fractured remains of the Armada, bearing a weight heavier than her scars. Her ship, the Vigil, was held together by little more than welds and prayer. Her crew slept in shifts so the engines could cool between bursts of flight. They had no banner, no resources, and no future. And yet every night as the stars wheeled by, her crew spoke of Kaelen. They spoke of his voice on the bridge, his steadiness in the storm, his refusal to retreat when retreat was survival. They spoke of him not as a man but as a flame that refused to die. Saren listened, and in her chest something long dormant began to stir. If Kaelen had lived, she thought, what would he have wanted? If he had perished, what had he died for? Her answer was the same: not crowns, not conquest, not history, each other. It began small, as most revolutions do. The Vigil answered a distress call from a mining outpost besieged by Threx raiders. They were outgunned, outnumbered, exhausted, but they fought anyway. Saren herself led the boarding party, plasma rifle scorching as she tore through armored beasts who thought humans would cower. The outpost was saved, the raiders driven into the black. When the miners asked under what banner they had been saved, Saren gave the only answer she knew. No banner, only us. Word spread. Other fragments heard. The Nomad's Grace appeared weeks later, ragged survivors pledging themselves to Saren's cause. The Peregrine, patched with alien alloys, limped into orbit above her world and offered its guns. One by one, fragments became sparks. Sparks became fire, and the fire began to whisper, Kaelen lives. The crowned races, shaken by Orion, sought to smother this ember before it grew. The Verath dispatched hunting squadrons, their silver phalanxes prowling the lanes for crownless survivors. The Elari cut off trade to colonies suspected of aiding them. The Threx sent war claws, eager to gnash their teeth on Terran bones. And yet everywhere they struck, the crownless rose again. Ships long thought dead appeared from the dark, striking supply lines, sabotaging palaces, liberating slaves held under dynastic rule. Their attacks were not victories of scale but of spirit, each strike a reminder that the Crownless Armada had not perished in Orion, that its ghost walked still. At the center of these whispers was the same name, Kaelen. Some swore they had seen him on the bridge of a raiding ship, eyes alight with fire. Others claimed his voice crackled through the void, rallying fighters with words that should have died at Orion. A few said the Eidolon itself had been rebuilt in the shadows, its ghostly hull sliding through nebulae like a revenant. Saren never confirmed nor denied these tales. When asked, she only said, does it matter? Whether Kaelen lives in flesh or in legend, he lives in us, and that is enough. But in truth, Saren carried her own secret, for deep within the Vigil's hold lay a sealed pod, scorched, battered, but intact. It had been found adrift weeks after Orion, tangled in the debris of the Coalition flagship. Inside it lay a man, broken, unconscious, but breathing, Admiral Kaelen. His body bore the price of fire, burns, shattered bones, a lung half ruined. He had not woken since, yet the medics whispered that his heart still beat like a war drum, steady and defiant. Saren kept his survival hidden. To reveal it would paint a target brighter than any crown upon his head. Let the galaxy believe in ghosts, she thought. Let the crown chase phantoms. Meanwhile, the Armada would rebuild, growing stronger in the shadow of their doubt. And when Kaelen woke, if he woke, the galaxy would tremble anew. In the months that followed, the legend deepened. The Crownless Armada, once shattered, rose again in scattered pockets across the spiral arms. Ships of every shape and origin joined. Freighters, smugglers, deserters from crowned navies who had grown weary of fighting for thrones. They painted no insignia on their hulls, carried no lineage in their blood. Yet when they fought with a unity no dynasty could understand. And always in their hearts they carried the whisper, Kaelen is with us. It was not a banner. It was not a crown. It was something stronger. Far beyond the reach of crowned patrols in the hidden depths of a derelict station orbiting a forgotten star, Kaelen stirred. His eyes flickered beneath closed lids. His scarred hands twitched against the sheets. In dreams he walked through the ashes of Orion, hearing the voices of the dead. They did not condemn him. They did not mourn. They only whispered one truth over and over until it burned like fire in his chest. We fight for each other. And as his heart thundered, Kaelen opened his eyes. The ghost was flesh once more. The fire reborn. The first breath was agony. Kaelen's lungs fought the air like it was poison. Each gasp clawing through scar tissue burned into him at Orion. Pain lanced across his body, scars tightening like chains. Yet when his eyes opened and the ceiling of the medbay swam into focus, he felt none of the despair that pain usually brings. He was alive. And with that realization came a flood. The screams of Orion, the blinding light of the Eidolon's sacrifice, the faces of the men and women who had followed him into the storm. They were gone. Yet he remained, and in the silence of that realization, he felt a weight heavier than any crown descend upon him. Responsibility. Commander Saren was the first to greet him. She entered the med bay like a shadow pulled taut by duty, her uniform scorched and patched, her eyes hollow with sleepless nights. When she saw Kaelen awake, her composure cracked for the first time in months. Relief surged through her in a single shuddering breath. "You're supposed to be dead," she said softly, standing at his side. "I was," Kaelen rasped, his voice raw, the sound of gravel dragged across steel. But death was too crowded. Saren almost smiled. Almost. But her face hardened again, for she carried truths heavier than joy. The Armada is gone. Or at least it was. What's left of us has been living on ghosts and whispers. Kaelen turned his head slowly, every muscle protesting. His reflection flickered in the polished steel wall. A man remade in scars, his hair burned to stubble, his body broken yet unyielding. "Ghosts and whispers," he repeated, his voice low. "Sometimes that's enough to start a fire." And indeed the fire had already begun. The months following Orion had transformed the Crownless into something new. No longer an armada of ships sailing together. They were now an idea that spread like sparks across dry grass. On the frontier world of Helix, a band of farmers armed only with repurposed threshers and shotguns had driven off a Threx raiding party, declaring themselves Kaelen's kin. On the gas mining rigs of Zalara, workers had risen against their Verath overseers, chanting songs of the Crownless as they wrestled control of the rigs with bare hands and torches. In hidden asteroid fields, smugglers had painted the word Eidolon across their hulls, daring crowned patrols to strike them. Everywhere fragments rose. They did not wait for orders. They did not follow banners. They fought because Kaelen's legend told them they could, and that terrified the crowned. The Verath lords convened in their silver palaces, their voices dripping venom. This ghost must end. Kaelen must be declared dead and his followers hunted like vermin. The Elari nobles, faces veiled with jeweled masks, sneered from their sapphire halls. Humanity was fragile once, but this belief makes them iron. Belief must be broken. The Threx war chieftains, restless in their spiked thrones, snarled with hunger. "Then let us feed. We will scatter their bones so wide no whisper can remain." And so the crowned began to sharpen their blades anew. But Kaelen had risen, and with him the Armada would rise again. His recovery was slow yet relentless. Each day he forced his broken body into motion. First steps, then drills. First whispers, then commands. Pain was constant, but he welcomed it. Pain was proof he still lived, still had work to do. Saren kept his return hidden from the galaxy. Even among their own, only the closest circle knew the truth. To the wider Armada, Kaelen remained a ghost, a myth walking beside them unseen. Saren wanted it that way. But Kaelen knew myths could only lead so far. At some point, flesh had to return. And so, on the day his body finally obeyed his will again, he stood upon the bridge of the vigil. The crew fell silent, eyes wide, breaths caught. They had spoken his name in whispers for months, but to see him there, scarred, alive, standing was like witnessing the impossible given form. Kaelen looked at them, at the miners with calloused hands turned to soldiers, at the children grown into gunners, at the faces who had bled for each other without banners or crowns. He spoke only 3 words. "We are fire." And with those words, the Crownless Armada was reborn. Their rebirth was not grand. There were no fanfares, no parades, no golden insignias painted across hulls. Their ships were still patchwork, their weapons scavenged, their numbers meager. But what they lacked in grandeur, they carried in ferocity. Kaelen led not as a monarch, but as a brother among brothers, a soldier among soldiers. His orders were not decrees but promises, that none would be left behind, that every sacrifice would be honored, that no dynasty would ever break them so long as they fought for each other, and so they fought. The Vigil and her ragtag escorts struck a Verath convoy, dismantling its phalanx with guerrilla precision, not for conquest, but to free the human slaves chained within its holds. When the captives stepped onto the decks, tears streaking their soot-stained faces, Kaelen said nothing, only clasped their hands, as if they had been comrades all along. On Zalara, Kaelen personally led a strike to liberate the gas mining rigs, standing shoulder to shoulder with workers armed in rags. The crowned fled before them, unable to comprehend why miners fought like soldiers and soldiers fought like family. And in every strike, in every liberation, the whispers grew louder. Kaelen lives. The Armada rises, the Crowned could not ignore it. Their hunts became frenzied, desperate. Fleets swept across the lanes, torching colonies suspected of harboring Crownless. Spies infiltrated settlements, spreading lies that Kaelen was a puppet, that his ghost was manufactured. Bounties larger than planetary treasuries were placed on his head, but it only fanned the fire. For every village burned, 10 more rose to arms. For every spy unmasked, 100 volunteers joined. For every bounty announced, 1,000 whispered, "If he is worth that much, then he must truly live." The Crowned had given the Crownless their greatest weapon, their fear. One night, as Kaelen stood alone on the Vigil's observation deck, Saren joined him. Beyond the viewport, a nebula unfurled like a shroud of flame, casting their scarred ship in crimson light. "You know this can't last," Saren said quietly. "Every dynasty in the galaxy is aligning against us. Sooner or later, they'll come with everything they have." Kaelen did not look away from the stars. His eyes burned with the same fire that had carried him through Orion. "Then let them come," he said. "They fight for crowns. We fight for each other, and the galaxy has never seen what that truly means." Saren studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She had followed him into the fire once. She would do so again, and so the fire spread. Across the spiral arms in the shadow of dynasties older than suns, the Crownless Armada rose, not as a fleet, but as a movement. Not as a monarchy, but as a family. Kaelen lived, and the Crowned began to understand a truth more terrifying than death. You cannot kill what fights not for throne or banner, but for each other. The siege of Helix was not a jewel of the galaxy. It had no gilded palaces, no crowns forged in its furnaces. It was a world of dust and wind, where farmers wrestled grain from stubborn soil and miners bled in tunnels of iron. Its skies were red with storms, its oceans shallow and bitter. To the Crowned, Helix was nothing more than a footnote in their maps, a supply stop, a tax ledger, a colony to be squeezed until it broke. But to the Crownless, Helix was everything. It was home. When the Armada rose again from the ashes of Orion, Helix was the first to stand openly at their side. Its farmers offered food, its miners offered ore, its children carried messages between outposts with wide, fearless eyes. They took no oath but one, "We are with you," and so, when word came that the Crowned Coalition had set its gaze upon Helix, no one ran. They dug in. Kaelen stood on the windswept plateau that overlooked Helix's capital settlement. It was a sprawl of rust-red domes and towers clinging stubbornly to the earth, battered by storms but unbroken. Beyond it, the horizon burned with the glow of drop pods and engines descending from orbit. The Crowned were coming. Beside him, Commander Saren tightened her gauntlets. Scouts confirmed 3 Verath phalanxes inbound, supported by Elari cruisers. And the Threx? 6 warclaws at least. Their full weight is here. Kaelen's scarred face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky. "Then Helix will be our anvil," he said, "and the Armada the hammer." Saren exhaled, not in fear but in grim acceptance. The battle ahead would be unlike Orion. Here they could not vanish into the mists or strike from shadows. Here they would stand, and if they fell, they would fall together. The preparations began. Farmers turned plows into barricades, hammering steel into shields. Miners rigged tunnels with explosives, every shaft a trap waiting to be sprung. Children carried water to the soldiers, their faces set with the same fire as their parents. Old men and women who had seen too much war sat by the gates with rifles in their laps, steady hands on weathered stocks. Above, the Armada's ships formed a ragged line in orbit. They were few, no more than 20, and many scarred from battles past, but their hulls glowed like embers in the night. Each captain knew their task, to hold the skies for as long as breath remained, and at the heart of it all Kaelen walked. He did not command from a throne or a bunker. He walked among his people, scarred hand resting on shoulders, his voice low and steady. He spoke not of glory or conquest, but of family, of bonds, of the simple truth that to stand for each other was the only crown worth wearing. By the time the first Verath ships pierced the clouds, Helix was ready. The sky tore open. Phalanxes descended in diamond formations, silver hulls gleaming even through the storm. Behind them, Elari cruisers unfurled sapphire sails, bending sunlight into lances of plasma. Threx claws dropped like meteors, their hulls bristling with hunger. The ground shook as drop pods struck, vomiting armored soldiers into the dust. Their banners unfurled, crowns etched in fire, symbols of dynasties that had never known defeat. And opposite them, on the plateau and in the streets below, the Crownless stood. Farmers in patched armor, miners with drills and rifles, children clutching sling stones, soldiers too weary to stand but refusing to kneel. The Crowned laughed, and then the battle began. It was not elegant. It was not beautiful. It was fire and fury, grit and blood. The Verath marched in precision lines, their silver armor unbroken. They met miners charging from tunnels with detonations that split the earth beneath their feet. Entire phalanxes fell into the ground, swallowed by fire and stone. The Elari rained light upon the city, their plasma lances tearing through domes and towers. But the farmers had prepared. They raised shields cut from ship hulls, deflecting the beams long enough for crownless ships above to strike back, weaving through fire with desperate ferocity. The Threx were the worst. They tore into the streets, claws rending walls and flesh alike. Yet for every beast that fell upon a family, 10 more rose in defiance. Mothers drove blades into armored hides. Children lit explosives beneath their feet. Old men pulled triggers with hands that did not tremble. The Crownless did not fight as soldiers of a dynasty. They fought as family, each one willing to bleed, to break, to burn, not for a throne, but for the person standing beside them. Kaelen moved through the chaos like a shadow given form. He fought not as an admiral, but as one among them. His scarred hands fired rifles until barrels melted, wielded blades until they snapped. He pulled comrades from rubble, shouted orders through smoke, and when eyes faltered, he steadied them with his own. Again and again the Crowned surged. Again and again the Crownless held hours became days. The sky above Helix burned with wreckage, ships falling like stars into the soil. The city became a labyrinth of fire, every street a battlefield, every home a fortress. The Crowned lost soldiers by the thousands, their banners trampled into mud, and still, Helix stood. On the third day, the coalition unleashed their final blow. A Verath dreadnought descended, its bulk blotting out the sun. Its cannons were city killers, meant to erase entire populations with a single strike. The Crownless had nothing that could match it. No weapon, no fleet, no miracle. The dreadnought fired. The plateau erupted in fire. The capital shook to its foundations. Thousands fell, their lives extinguished in an instant. But in the smoke, the Armada rose again. Kaelen himself led the charge, rallying what ships remained for one final strike. The Vigil, engines screaming, tore into the dreadnought's shadow. Around her, battered escorts flung themselves at the beast one by one, each a spark in the dark. Miners detonated tunnels beneath its landing struts, explosions rippling upward. Farmers launched rockets built from fertilizer and steel, and when the Crownless had nothing left, they hurled themselves bodily into the fire, their deaths buying seconds and seconds buying hope. At last, Kaelen drove the Vigil into the dreadnought's heart. Not a sacrifice, but a spear. Its reactor tore open in a blaze that split the sky, the dreadnought collapsing into a burning carcass that fell upon the plain. And when the smoke cleared, Helix still stood. The Crowned had brought their full weight. Their banners, their crowns, their thrones of arrogance. And yet they had been broken. Helix was not a jewel. It was dust, storm, and fire. But in its dust, a crownless people had stood against empires and refused to kneel. When the news spread across the galaxy, it was not the Crowned who sang of Helix. It was the common, the forgotten, the beaten and broken who whispered, "The Crownless held. The Armada lives." The fire cannot be extinguished, and for the first time the Crowned realized their laughter was gone. In its place was fear. The chains of the nobles, the fires of Helix still smoldered when the galaxy trembled. News of the siege spread not through official channels. The Crowned buried their losses in silence, but through whispers, smuggled messages and half-burnt transmissions carried by wandering traders. In the space between dynasties, in the slums of the Verath spires and the mines of the Threx, the story took root. Helix stood. The Armada lives. The Crownless fight harder than kings, for those who had lived entire lives beneath banners they never chose. It was a spark. For the Crowned, it was a nightmare. Kaelen sat in the Vigil's shattered war room, the scars of the dreadnought strike etched into every panel. Around him gathered the captains of the Armada, faces weary, armor scorched, eyes carrying both pride and grief. "We held," Saren said, her voice raw from days of command. "But we cannot only hold. If we remain on the defensive, they will come again in greater numbers. And next time, there will be no Helix left to save." Kaelen's scarred fingers traced the star chart projected before them. The Crowned Dynasties ruled with chains, not only armies but laws, debts, taxes, and thrones carved from the backs of their people. Break the chains and their empires would wither from within. He looked to his captains. "Then we will not wait. The Armada will strike, not for conquest, not for banners, but to break chains. Wherever people bend under crowns, we will give them breath again." And thus began the War of Liberation. The first target was Lyros, a mining world of shattered mountains and blackened skies. Lyros was bled dry by Verath tax lords. Its people worked the mines until their bones broke, their children born coughing dust, their lives weighed and sold like ore. The Verath crowns demanded production quotas higher than what the mines could yield, so overseers took payment in flesh. For every shortfall, they dragged men, women, and children into slave caravans never to be seen again. The Armada arrived not as conquerors, but as shadows in the night. Kaelen led the strike himself, guiding dropships into the canyon depths. Miners blinked through dust as strangers in battered armor emerged from the haze. Strangers who did not take but gave. Food, medicine, weapons placed in calloused hands. "The crowns would have you believe you are alone," Kaelen told them, his voice echoing off the stone. "But you are not. You are part of us. Rise, and we rise with you." The spark of Helix ignited the minds of Lyros. When the Verath garrison marched to put down the unrest, they found not starving miners, but an army forged from despair. Tunnels collapsed on their phalanxes. Acid streams redirected into their camps. Explosives buried in carts pushed by children who laughed as banners burned. Above, the Armada cut through the Verath fleet with a ferocity born not of numbers, but of unity. The Vigil, still limping from Helix, tore apart warships twice her size, not because she was stronger, but because every crew member would rather burn with her than abandon the people below. By the battle's end, the Verath Lord of Lyros was dragged before his former slaves. He begged for his crown to shield him, but the people spat upon it. The Armada did not take the crown. They shattered it, grinding it into the dust from which the miners had risen. Lyros was free, and Lyros was not alone. The Armada moved like wildfire, striking where the crowned thought their chains unbreakable. On Verath, they dismantled Elari energy siphons that drained the planet's core to fuel distant palaces. On Nith, they stormed Threx breeding pits where children were raised as soldiers from birth, freeing thousands who had never seen the sky. Each victory was not just a battle won, but a story told. Stories that spread faster than ships, carried in songs and whispers and graffiti scrawled across walls the crowns could never silence. The Armada breaks chains. The crownless rise. The crowned grew afraid. In the halls of Veilshroud Dynasties, lords argued in fury, each demanding the Armada be crushed before rebellion spread to their own subjects. The Elari queens cloaked their fear in silk, sending fleets draped in banners of vengeance. Even the Threx war masters, who had never bowed to any crown but their own bloodlust, began to question whether the crownless might undo them from within. But fear is a dangerous seed. The more the crowned punished their subjects, raising taxes, tightening grips, silencing dissent with blades, the more rebellion spread. For every chain broken by the Armada, 10 more cracked on their own. The crowns were bleeding themselves, yet within the Armada, there was no triumph without cost. Kaelen bore it most heavily. Every victory meant new allies, new families woven into their cause, but also new dead. Each freed world left scars of its own, mass graves dug beside burning palaces, widows clutching rifles dropped by sons. Late at night, Kaelen walked the decks of the Vigil. He did not sleep. He listened, to the hum of engines, to the quiet sobs of soldiers mourning in their bunks, to the silence of stars outside. His scars itched, old wounds whispering reminders of Orion's ghosts. Saren found him once, staring out into the black. "You can't carry them all," she said softly. Kaelen did not look at her. "If I don't, who will?" But in the silence of the void, the Armada began to change. It was no longer a fleet. It was a movement. No longer captains and crews, but entire peoples. Farmers became pilots. Miners became engineers. Freed children grew into soldiers not of crowns, but of family. And for the first time in history, a people fought not for coin or crown, but for each other, across worlds, across bloodlines, across species. The Crowned Dynasties had armies, navies, banners of silk and fire. The Crownless Armada had something far greater. They had purpose. In the 10th month of the campaign, the Crown struck back. The Verath, Elari, and Threx, who had never fought as one, joined forces at last. Binding their banners into a coalition of desperation, they unleashed a fleet unlike any seen before. 1,000 ships, each marked with crowns, moving as a storm across the stars. Their target was not a world, but the Armada itself. They came for Kaelen. They came for the Crownless. And this time they swore there would be no survivors. The shattered constellation. The galaxy had not seen such a fleet in 1,000 years. From the black edge of space they came, a storm of crowns. Verath phalanxes in endless silver lines. Elari cruisers unfurling sails of sapphire light. Threx claws bristling with bloodlust. More than 1,000 ships, engines glowing like a constellation dragged across the void. Their banners filled the stars. Crowns upon crowns, dynasties united not by trust but by fear. Fear of the fire that spread from Helix and Lyros. Fear of the spark that might consume their thrones. And at the constellation's heart burned a single promise. Erase the Armada. Break the Crownless. Silence the fire. Kaelen watched from the bridge of the Vigil, the galaxy's light shimmering against his scarred face. Around him, the Armada gathered. Barely 100 ships, most scarred. Some little more than freighters bolted with armor, all patched with desperation. A handful of vessels compared to the storm that bore down upon them. To any crowned admiral, the outcome was certain. To Kaelen, certainty was a chain he had long since broken. "They outnumber us 10 to 1, Saren murmured, her voice steady but low. Kaelen's gaze did not leave the storm. "Then each crownless must be worth 10 crowned. We've proven that before. We will again. The Armada did not fight as others fought. The Crowned relied on formations, perfect, glittering, inflexible. Their fleets moved like dancers on a stage, every step measured by tradition, every strike bound by ritual. The Crownless moved like fire. They scattered into clouds, weaving through asteroid belts and nebulae, darting in and out of the storm. Miners and freighters rammed into frigates. Farmers and gunboats darted between cruisers, their patched engines screaming. Children who had never known a day without chains now piloted fighters, their laughter sharp against the void. Wherever the Crowned turned, the Armada was there. Not a line, but a swarm. Not a dynasty, but a tide. The battle lasted days. On the first day, the Armada struck the Coalition's flanks, tearing through supply barges and communication relays. Entire Verath formations found themselves blind, their silver lines stumbling into chaos. On the second day, they lured Elari cruisers into the dust rings of Luthen, where their radiant sails became snares, tangled and torn by debris. Crownless fighters lit them aflame, the dust fields glowing like a second sun. On the third day, the Threx claws surged. They cut through the Armada with brutal speed, boarding ships, slaughtering crews in close combat. But for every Crownless vessel taken, another rammed itself into a claw's engines, detonating in fire that lit the void. The constellation began to fracture. Yet for all their fury, the Armada was bleeding. Half their ships were gone. Entire families, entire freed peoples vanished into flame. The Vigil herself was scarred, her hull cracked and bleeding air, her crew moving like ghosts in the dim glow of emergency lights. Kaelen stood at the heart of it all, his scarred hands gripping the railing as if holding the Armada together by will alone. Every report was another wound. Leros miners lost in a plasma storm. Nith children gone with their freighter. Helix veterans swallowed by the Threx. Each one carved deeper into him. Each one whispered, "You cannot save them all," but still he did not yield. On the fourth day, the Coalition unleashed its heart, the Crownbreaker, a warship unlike any other, forged from the combined might of dynasties. Its hull was a continent of steel, its cannons the size of cities. Crowns upon crowns were etched into its surface, a floating throne for all who ruled. Its arrival blotted out stars. The Coalition believed it invincible. They believed its sheer mass, its endless firepower, would erase the Armada in a single sweep. Kaelen stared at it in silence. His crew waited breathless, knowing what must come, and then he spoke, low and steady. "Every crown believes itself eternal. But crowns are only metal. People endure. That is our weapon. That is our fire." The Armada gathered for one final strike, not in neat formations, but as they were, freighters, gunboats, fighters, battered cruisers. Every ship that could still fly, every soul still breathing. They swarmed toward the Crownbreaker like sparks toward dry tinder. The warship unleashed hell. Cannons roared, beams cut across the void, entire squadrons erased in blinding fire. But for every crownless ship destroyed, two more closed the distance. They did not fight for crowns. They fought for each other. For Helix. For Lyros. For every chain shattered, every banner burned. The closer they drew, the brighter they burned. Kaelen led from the Vigil. Through storms of plasma and debris, he carved a path straight for the Crownbreaker's heart. Saren stood beside him, shouting orders into comms, her eyes bright with fire. The crew moved like one body, scarred and weary but unbreakable. And all around them, the Armada flung itself into the storm. Ships rammed into cannons, detonating in bursts that tore open the beast's armor. Fighters swarmed vents and seams, planting charges, vanishing in fire. Families on freighters sang as they hurled themselves into engines, their voices the last thing the Crowned ever heard. The Crownbreaker bled. At last, the Vigil reached its hull. Kaelen stared at the vast surface before him, crowns etched in endless lines. His scars ached, his body screamed, but his voice was steady. "This ends here." The Vigil plunged into the breach. Explosions rippled across the Crownbreaker's spine, tearing through reactors, shattering crowns etched into its core. The constellation that had marched to erase the Crownless fractured, then shattered, then burned. When the fire cleared, the void was silent. The Armada was broken, half its ships gone, its survivors scattered and bleeding. But the Coalition was worse. Their fleets were in ruins, their thrones shaken, their banners burned. The Crownbreaker was no more, and across the galaxy whispers rose again, louder now, unignorable. The Armada shattered the constellation. The crowns are not eternal. The crownless endure. For the first time in living memory, dynasties trembled not at each other, but at the people they had ruled for centuries. The Crownless Armada was no longer a nuisance. It was a revolution. The ashes and the oath, the battlefield drifted in silence. Where once the sky had blazed with fire and banners, now only wreckage remained. Shards of Verath silver, tatters of Elari sails, splinters of Threx claws, all tumbling endlessly through the void. Here and there sparks flickered, shattered reactors leaking light into the dark, ships broken open like rib cages, their bones scattered across the stars. Among the wreckage moved the survivors of the Armada. Their ships limped, hulls cracked, engines sputtering, patched with desperation. Of the 100 that had stood against the crowned storm, barely 40 still burned. Some had no weapons left, others no shields. A few little more than drifting shells held together by stubbornness. The vigil led them, her own hull torn and scarred, her bridge lights dim, but her heart unbroken. Kaelen stood at the viewport, staring at the graveyard he had helped make. His scarred hands rested on the glass, his breath fogging faintly against the cold. Behind him, Saren and the crew moved quietly, their voices hushed as if unwilling to disturb the silence of the dead. Every ship lost weighed on him. Every family gone, every voice silenced. He saw them in the wreckage, miners who had once laughed in the tunnels of Lyros, children freed from Nith now swallowed by flame, farmers of Helix who had never known stars before they bled among them. The Armada had won. The constellation of crowns was shattered. But victory had never felt so much like loss. On the third day after the battle, the survivors gathered, not in palaces or throne rooms, but in the cold belly of the Vigil's hangar bay, where ships rested side by side like wounded beasts. Hundreds came, captains, engineers, farmers, miners, children. Not soldiers, not courtiers, but people. They stood in silence first, the air heavy with grief. Then names were spoken. One by one, voices called out into the hangar, naming the lost. Each name was answered not with silence, but with a chorus of voices repeating it, carrying it, holding it, refusing to let it vanish. The names filled the bay for hours. By the time the last voice faltered, there were tears on every face, but the silence that followed was not despair. It was resolve. Kaelen stepped forward. His face was a map of scars, his armor dented and scorched, his body exhausted. But his voice was steady. "We stood against 1,000 crowns," he said, the words low but carrying, "and we are still here." He looked at them, not as an admiral, but as one of them. The crowns believe that power lies in metal and banners, but power lies here. He pressed a hand against his chest, scarred fingers curling over his heart. "In the will to fight for each other. For every chain broken, for every voice freed." He paused, the silence deepening, every eye fixed on him. "They will come again, with more ships, with more fire. They will not stop because they cannot. The crowns know only how to consume, but we are not crowns. We are not thrones. We are the fire they cannot quench." He raised his scarred hand, open offering. "So I ask you, not as soldiers, but as family. Will you swear with me, not to crowns, not to banners, but to each other, that no matter the cost, no matter the fire, we will not bow, that the Armada will endure, not as a fleet, but as a people?" The silence broke. Hands rose one by one, then all together, scarred, calloused, trembling, strong. Voices rose with them, not chanting, not shouting, but swearing, raw, unpolished, real. It was not an oath written in law. It was not bound by ritual. It was a promise that bound them tighter than any crown could, the oath of the crownless. From that moment, the Armada was no longer a fleet hiding in shadows. It became a movement that could not be erased. Every ship that joined carried the oath. Every world freed took it as their own. Families whispered it around fires. Children scrawled it on walls. Entire systems began to murmur the words in defiance, the oath spreading like wildfire through cracks in the dynasty's rule. The crowned could destroy ships. They could burn cities. They could kill bodies, but they could not kill an oath, and in their palaces the crowned felt it. The Verath lords spoke in hushed tones, fearful of miners who now raised banners of fire instead of silver. The Elari queens cloaked their halls in light, but their laughter rang hollow, their people restless beneath their veils. The Threx war masters grew crueler, whipping their soldiers into blood frenzy. But behind their claws lay unease. The Armada had no throne, no king, no crown, and yet it had become the greatest threat the dynasties had ever known. Still, the price was heavy. The Armada limped from system to system, patching hulls with scrap, rationing fuel, carrying grief like ballast. For every world freed, another begged for help. For every chain broken, 10 more clanged in the dark. Kaelen carried it all. His scars ached, his eyes hollow, his voice steady only because it had to be. Saren watched him with worry, knowing the fire that drove him could consume him as easily as it had consumed their enemies. But Kaelen had no time to falter. The oath had been sworn, and the galaxy was beginning to believe. Whispers turned to uprisings. On Verath, peasants stormed tax offices with nothing but tools, shouting the oath as their banner. On Nith, children freed from pits took up arms, swearing to fight until every pit was emptied. On Helix, scarred veterans raised the words across their storm-swept skies, their voices carrying into the void. The Crown struck back with fury. They sent fleets, assassins, inquisitors. They silenced cities in fire, buried rebellions in mass graves, burned villages until nothing but ash remained. But ash could not smother fire. Every atrocity only spread the oath further. Every chain tightened only made the sound of breaking louder. And in the silence of his quarters, Kaelen understood the truth. The Armada was no longer his. It had outgrown him. Outgrown the vigil, outgrown the fleet itself. It had become a promise carried by millions across the stars. A promise that no dynasty could silence. He was no longer leading a fleet. He was carrying a fire, and fires once loosed cannot be chained. The ashes of the shattered constellation became the soil in which the oath took root. The Armada endured. The fire spread. The crowns trembled, and the galaxy, for the first time in an age, began to dream of something beyond thrones. The burning spiral. The oath had begun as whispers in a hangar. Now it burned in every corner of the galaxy. The first sparks it began small. A miner's strike on Verath that refused to break even under lash and fire. A caravan of farmers on Leros who turned their wagons into barricades. A chorus of children on Ninth, once broken and voiceless, now singing the words in defiance until their keepers trembled. Each act seemed tiny, insignificant against the towering dynasties, but together they formed a pattern, a spiral of fire spreading outward from the shattered constellation. Unstoppable, feeding itself with every chain broken. The crowns thought it was chaos, disorder. They did not yet understand it was order of a different kind, the order of people, choosing freedom over fear. The Armada as a symbol. The Armada itself remained scattered, licking its wounds, its ships patched with scrap, its hulls held together by oath more than metal. But they were no longer alone. Every time a rebellion flared, the Armada was invoked. Survivors painted the vigil's shape on walls. Songs carried Kaelen's name across stations. Saren's fire was whispered about as if it were a living spirit guiding the oppressed. The Armada had become a myth. And myths, the Crown soon learned, were harder to kill than fleets. The fire spreads on Threx Prime. Gladiators in the blood arenas rose mid-match, refusing to slaughter one another. They broke their chains, turned their weapons on their masters, and shouted the oath as the arenas erupted in chaos. On Verath's moons, silver miners, long crushed beneath endless quotas, collapsed their shafts deliberately, entombing the overseers in the wealth they had bled for. On Elari's sanctums, even within halls of light where queens wove illusions of eternal peace, cracks appeared, novices tearing down veils, proclaiming that truth mattered more than beauty. Everywhere, the oath burned. The spiral was born, a cascade of uprisings, rebellions and revolts spiraling outward across the systems, faster than the crowns could crush them. The crowns strike back, the crowned answered with terror. The Verath lords unleashed fleets that turned cities into molten glass. The Elari queens cloaked assassins in veils of light, blades dripping with silence. The Threx war masters released their scourge legions, feral and merciless, sowing slaughter without restraint. Entire worlds were erased. Colonies reduced to nothing but ash. The message was clear. Defiance meant extinction. But the Armada's oath twisted even this into fire. Survivors of massacres did not beg for crowns to return. They swore louder. Louder still, the spiral did not die. It grew. Kaelen's burden in the heart of it. Kaelen bore the weight like a scar across his soul. Every victory sent him messages of hope. Every massacre sent him echoes of screams. He carried both, unable to silence either. His body was breaking, scars reopening, exhaustion etched deep, voice fraying from endless calls to lead, to comfort, to promise. But when he faltered, the oath carried him. Saren saw it. She stood at his side in silence, sometimes guiding him to rest when he would not, sometimes simply standing there like a flame refusing to go out. They were not just captain and crew anymore. They were symbols, and symbols could not afford to shatter. The turning point. The spiral reached its fiercest point on the world of Verath, a crossroads system at the heart of crowned trade routes. The crowns could not allow rebellion there. They unleashed their full fury, 3 dynasties together, fleets massing in a storm of fire. Verath was meant to be the lesson that would break the spiral once and for all, but the Armada arrived. Not alone. Behind them came a tide of broken ships crewed by farmers. Miners, freed slaves, smugglers, children with hands too small for weapons but too strong for surrender. The Battle of Verath was not elegant. It was not a duel of fleets. It was chaos. Ramshackle hulls slamming into warships, scavenged cannons blazing, voices shouting the oath into comms until it drowned out orders and fear alike. And in that chaos, the crowns broke. Their fleets, so used to crushing disciplined enemies, could not contain a tide that refused to fight like soldiers. Every time they thought the fire smothered, it flared elsewhere. Every time they silenced one voice, 10 more rose. The Armada did not win through strength. It won through refusal. By the battle's end, the crowned fleets fled. Verath stood free, and the spiral became unstoppable. The birth of a people after Verath, the Armada was no longer seen as a fleet alone. It became a people. Refugees, rebels, wanderers, all began calling themselves crownless. It was not a title of shame, but of pride. To be crownless meant to belong not to dynasties, but to the oath. On planets, they painted the spiral on walls, a fire curling outward into infinity. On ships, they carried no banners but scars and survival. On lips, they carried the words, "We are not thrones. We are fire." The crown still ruled their palaces. They still commanded fleets. But their dominion was crumbling, because the galaxy had learned to live without crowns. The whisper of fear in their halls. The crowned whispered of the Armada as if it were a plague. The Verath lords tightened their vaults, terrified of miners who now dreamed of storming them. The Elari queens layered illusions thicker, but the cracks in their veils widened daily. The Threx war masters drowned themselves in blood to stave off fear. But even their legions carried whispers of the oath. They had built empires on the certainty that the people were weak, divided, voiceless. But the spiral proved otherwise. The fire's shape Kaelen, weary yet unbroken, stood once more at the vigil's viewport. He looked not at wreckage this time, but at convoys of refugee ships flocking to the Armada, their lights burning like a second constellation. The Crownless Armada was no longer a fleet. It was a civilization being born in fire, a civilization without kings, without thrones, without crowns. And though Kaelen feared the cost still to come, though his scars ached with the weight of grief, he felt something stir beneath it all, something he had never thought to feel again. Hope. The spiral burned outward. The crowns trembled, and the galaxy for the first time in an age began to believe in freedom, the crowned reckoning. The galaxy had not seen unity among the crowned in 10,000 years. The Verath had always despised the Elari, calling them perfumed liars hiding daggers in silk. The Elari looked upon the Threx as beasts, brutes in blood and iron. The Threx considered both weak, their crowns brittle ornaments unfit for war. Yet fear is a binding force stronger than kinship. And nothing bred fear like the spiral. The summoning of thrones in the cold halls of the celestial Concord, a place carved into the hollow heart of a dying star, the dynasties gathered. Crowns glimmered in every shape, iron forged from suns, crystal spun from dying nebulae, bone carved from titans slain in ancient wars. They came draped in centuries, in arrogance, in wounds, and though their banners fluttered, though their thrones glistened, The air carried not triumph but desperation. The spiral had undone them. Entire sectors no longer bent knee. Tribute caravans ran empty. Workers sang the oath instead of toiling. Fleets returned not with victory, but with whispers of rebellion festering even among their own ranks. The lords, the queens, the war masters knew the truth. Their crowns were crumbling. So they came together for the first and perhaps the last time, to reckon with the Crownless Armada. The decision, the conclave was long. Voices clashed like blades. The Verath demanded extermination of every human world, scorched to nothing but glass. The Elari, calculating and cold, spoke of illusions vast enough to drown whole systems in lies, to smother the spiral in false dreams. The Threx, claws dripping with impatience, called for a slaughter so deep the void itself would choke on blood. But beneath the fury lay a shared conclusion. Nothing less than absolute annihilation would suffice. The Armada had to burn. Every ship, every whisper, every ember of rebellion, they would gather their fleets millions strong, the combined might of dynasties ancient and terrible, and unleash them upon the crownless in one decisive storm. They named it the Convergence War Host. A tide of banners, gilded and blood-soaked, meant to drown the galaxy in order once more. The gathering storm across the spiral arms. The war host formed. Verath dreadnoughts emerged from dockyards, silver blades sharper than planets. Elari illusion ships drifted from sanctums, their hulls like mirages, entire fleets hidden within veils of light. Threx war carriers surged from their forges, engines howling, their legions roaring oaths of slaughter. World after world trembled at the passage. Stars dimmed under the weight of so many crowns, and in the shadows between whispers spread. They are coming for the Armada. They are coming for the Crownless. The galaxy held its breath. The Armada prepares aboard the Vigil. Kaelen listened to the reports. His captain spoke with grim urgency. Scouts confirmed the impossible scale of the war host. Tens of thousands of ships unified in a tide unlike anything recorded. It was not a war. It was an extinction. The faces around him bore the truth. Engineers, once miners. Pilots, once smugglers. Children too young for war, yet carrying scars older than their years. They had fought in the spiral, bled, lost, endured, and now they stood on the edge of a storm greater than anything they had imagined. Kaelen looked at them, and for the first time in years, doubt sank into him like ice. Could even the fire of the Crownless withstand such a tide? It was Saren who spoke, quiet but fierce. They have gathered every banner, every crown. They think that makes them strong. But they have forgotten. Her hand clenched over her chest, over the place where her flame still burned. We are not held together by crowns. We are bound by each other. That is fire they cannot command. The silence that followed was heavy, not hopeless. Waiting. And Kaelen, scarred and weary, found himself standing straighter. The broadcast before the Armada moved. Kaelen spoke to the galaxy one final time. The message was not ornate. No banners framed him, no crowns gleamed above his head, only the battered bridge of the Vigil scarred by years of fire. To every world that still breathes, to every voice that still dares to sing the oath, hear me. The crowned have gathered. They march not only against us, but against all who dare to live without chains. Their banners will cover the stars. Their thrones will bleed worlds dry unless we stand. He paused, eyes heavy with both sorrow and fire. We are outnumbered. We are outgunned. But we are not outlived. We are the fire they cannot quench. We are the oath they cannot silence. And if we must fall, we will fall as crownless, not as slaves. Join us, stand with us, fight, not for crowns, but for each other. The message burned across comms, carried from world to world. And though no banners answered, no crowns pledged allegiance, the response came in silence that grew into thunder. Convoys of ragged ships altering course, rebels rushing to arms, entire colonies rising. The Crownless Armada swelled, not in majesty, but in defiance. The gathering before the storm, they met on the edge of the Veilon Rift. A wound in space where stars burned ragged. On one side, the Convergence War Host. A storm of banners so vast it seemed the galaxy itself bent before it. Crowns blazing, fleets arrayed like judgment incarnate. On the other, the Armada. Scarred, patchwork, fragile, yet unyielding. Refugee convoys interlaced with warships. Farmers flying beside soldiers. children watching with eyes too old for their years. The void between them hummed with tension. Kaelen stood on the bridge, watching the war host's banners spread like a shroud. For a moment, silence stretched eternal. Then he whispered, "Not for his crew, not for his fleet, but for himself. Crowns rust, banners burn, thrones fall, but we endure." The reckoning, the first shots had not yet fired. The Armada waited, the crowns waited, the galaxy waited. And in that breath before the storm, Kaelen felt it. The weight of every scar, every loss, every whisper of the oath carried across generations. He felt his mother's candlelight, his father's calloused hands, Saren's flame burning steady at his side. He felt the Armada not as ships but as people, as fire. The reckoning had come. And in the silence before it, Kaelen knew. Whether they won or fell, the Crownless would carve their truth into the stars. The void trembled. On one side, the Convergence war host stretched like a black tide, millions of crowned ships, banners gleaming, engines roaring like thunder. It was the weight of dynasties, of centuries, of oppression made manifest. On the other, the Armada burned. Scarred ships patched with scrap and hope, engines coughing, hulls cracked, weapons stolen or scavenged. Yet their lights burned bright. Convoys of farmers, miners, children, elders, outlaws, slaves. A constellation of the broken standing together. The silence between them was eternity. Then the storm began. The opening clash. The war host surged forward, a wall of silver, crystal, and blood iron. Cannons howled, lances of fire cutting through the dark. Entire squadrons of crownless ships vanished in an instant, shredded into dust. But the Armada did not break. They scattered, weaving through the tide, striking not with discipline but with desperation. Every ship moved like a story, miners crashing hulls into dreadnoughts, smugglers detonating cargo holds in suicide strikes, children guiding refugee ships through chaos while whispering the oath into comms. The void blazed. Where the war host was order, the Armada was fire. Kaelen's command on the Vigil's bridge. Kaelen barked orders through the storm. His voice was raw, his body shaking with exhaustion, but his eyes burned. Cut their supply lines, strike the carriers, break their formation. Saren stood beside him, her flame flaring brighter with each word, guiding gunners, mending wounded systems with impossible precision. Her fire seemed to dance across the Vigil's shattered controls, as if the ship itself fought beside her. Every second they lived was bought with blood, but every second mattered. The Armada was not fighting to win. It was fighting to be remembered. The turning point hours passed. The void became a graveyard, littered with wreckage, drifting bodies, burning crowns. And then the war host revealed its true weapon. From the heart of the fleet emerged the Crowned Colossus, a fortress ship the size of a moon, forged from the bones of 3 dynasties together. Its cannons were stars unto themselves, its hull a cathedral of thrones. It was not a ship. It was the Crowned made flesh. Its first volley tore through half the Armada's core, annihilating hundreds of ships in a single breath. Despair spread. Even the fire wavered. Kaelen knew. If the Colossus stood, the Armada would fall. The plan, he turned to Saren, voice hoarse. The Colossus must burn. Her eyes widened. She knew what he meant before he said it. The Vigil was the only ship close enough, the only one fast enough, the only one desperate enough. Kaelen placed a scarred hand on her shoulder. If we fall as fire. Do you understand? Saren's flame flickered, then steadied. She nodded. Together. The final charge, the Vigil broke from the Armada. Engines screaming, tearing through the storm. Crowned ships swarmed to block it, but the Armada saw and they moved. Farmers rammed interceptors. Miners detonated their ships to clear paths. Smugglers hurled themselves into blockade lines. Every sacrifice carved open space, every voice shouting the oath as they fell. The Vigil drove forward, scarred hull aflame, shields collapsing, but unstoppable. Kaelen felt the ship shudder beneath him, felt the fire of millions behind him, carrying him forward. The Colossus loomed. The last fire inside the Vigil. Systems failed one by one. Hull breaches tore open decks. Flames roared through corridors. Crew clung to stations, still shouting orders even as smoke filled their lungs. Kaelen staggered, blood on his lips, but his voice carried. Arm the core. All power to the engines. Saren's flame spread, wrapping the controls, guiding the ship like a living soul. Her light met his scars, and for a moment the bridge was not ruin, but a temple of fire. As the Colossus's cannons turned to end them, Kaelen whispered, "Not to crowns, not to enemies, but to his people, we are the fire. We endure." The vigil struck. Its core detonated in a sun's birth, tearing the Colossus open from crown to keel. The fortress ship screamed as it split, its banners burning, its thrones shattering. The crown's might, their symbol of eternity, was undone in an instant of fire. The silence. After the shockwave tore through the battlefield, crowned fleets scattered, fractured, their unity collapsing as swiftly as it had formed. Some fled, some fought one another, some simply froze in disbelief. The Armada, broken, bleeding, burning, did not pursue. They simply endured. In the silence that followed, across wreckage and ruin, voices rose. Not orders, not cheers, the oath whispered in broken ships, murmured by survivors floating in void, shouted by children in escape pods. We are not thrones. We are fire. The crowns had slain thousands. They had burned fleets. They had shattered the vigil, but the oath lived, and because it lived, the Armada endured. The legacy Kaelen was gone, the vigil reduced to ashes among the Colossus's ruin. Saren's flame had vanished with him, burned into the last charge, yet their fire had not died. In the years that followed, the dynasties fell one by one, not to fleets, not to armies, but to their own decay, as people refused to bend. The spiral became the Crownless Union. Not a throne, not an empire, but a pact of free worlds bound only by the oath. Children spoke Kaelen's name like legend. Elders lit candles in Saren's memory. Ships painted the vigil's outline on their hulls, not as weapon, but as reminder. No crown replaced the old. No throne rose. Instead, the fire spread. The last image, in the void where the battle had raged, where the vigil had burned, wreckage still drifted. And amid it, a shard of the Colossus's shattered throne spun slowly. Crown twisted, broken, upon it etched by fire. 3 words glimmered faintly. We endure. Epilogue. The crowned had believed eternity was theirs. But eternity belongs not to crowns. It belongs to fire, to people, to the Crownless Armada. And in every world where chains had been broken, in every child's whisper, in every scar carried proudly, the fire lived, unquenchable, eternal. The Armada was gone. The Armada was forever,